Hey everybody, welcome to Badaboom. I'm Troy.
I'm
We got
Chris.
we got Chris. We just finished watching the new Hellboy movie, The Cricket Man. I read the comic just a couple days ago. And Chris, what did you think? I have some thoughts, but we held off on talking about it because as soon as the movie was over, we jumped on. So I'm eager to hear what you think about this movie.
Yeah, I actually liked it, maybe because my expectations were pretty low. I think the movie, strangely enough, is the most faithful to the Hellboy comics and Mike Mignola's sort of like vision. But I think the problem with the movie is that the Guillermo del Toro ones exist.
Yeah,
So visually the movies have gone backwards. You know, you have those first two movies that were directed by Guillermo del Toro. And then you also have some animated movies that were pretty good, like set sort of like in that universe a little bit. And then there's been games, and then you had the David Harbour Hellboy movie, which was okay. I think Time has done that
yeah.
movie pretty well. Like I think when it came out, it was pretty like funny and just I think people were ready to dunk on it because it wasn't a Guillermo del Toro movie. And then this one, obviously the first images came out and I think a lot of people were like, "Man, this is really low budget." But funny enough, I think that actually fits the world of Hellboy. But again, the problem is like it's gone backwards. Like, like if you watch Marvel movies, you watch that really like bad like 90s Captain America movie and you're like, "Oh, like this is the 90s" and stuff like that. But progressively, like even if you think the movies have gone like bad in the MCU, they kind of like look better as time goes along. Hellboy has actually gone backwards, which
Yeah.
kind of does not do it well because I think the movie tries a lot to sort of like, do some trickery and do a lot of practical effects. But like, I actually recently rewatched the first Hellboy movie and I was like, this still holds up visually. And I think that's sort of like the worst part. If you've seen those movies, it's really hard to let them go. But overall, I like the movie. I think they figured out a way to make something. And I think it's sort of, and it is written by Mike Mignola. It is the most true to those comics and his vision. So if you're a Hellboy fan, I think you'll really like it. If you are a fan of the Hellboy movies, this particularly the first two, probably not. But overall, I liked it.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it was a good movie. I would probably be
Mm.
something I'd be like, hey, if you're gonna watch this on a plane, you're gonna be like, all right, it's a good movie. But like the first half, I was like, all right, this is pretty comic book accurate. I'm really liking it. And as we got further into it, I'm like, okay, we're definitely highlighting some things in the comics, but we're moving away from it. And even as I was reading the comics, I was like, how are they gonna make this a movie? Because Hellboy doesn't talk like at all in the comics. Like he has the fewest lines, and it's his comic book. Like everyone else is talking, and he's kind of just like, "Hey, I guess I'm here," and that's it.
Well, I think the movie actually does that because like if you think about like all the times he talks, it's not really substantive, but substantive, whatever that
Substance.
word. Yeah, there's not
Yeah,
much of substance. He's really sort of saying like one-liners and
yeah,
sort of like commenting on like what's going on, but not really like going into a deep monologue. He's just like, yeah, like I'm gonna kill this person, or and it works, but yeah, it and I think that's why they introduced, even though it's a smaller movie, like most of the speaking parts and the exposition and the dialogue is done exclusively from the point of view of the other characters. But yeah, I do think the end sort of like tries to do too much. Like there's a lot going on at once, and there's a lot of different like imagery, like horror imagery, which is cool, but sometimes it doesn't let anything kind of sit. It's like, all right, like it goes from one thing to the next to the next to the next, like really
yeah.
like kind of fast. So like some of the imagery that is like powerful, it doesn't really sit with you too long. And some of it's weird, like when the girl is like wrapped in the snake and you're like,
Yeah.
it was like, wait, her body just was filled through this thing, and then she was bitten by a mosquito. Like she went through a lot in like a span of like 15 minutes. And it was just weird, like stuff like that. But again, maybe because my bar was like so low with some of the early sort of trailers and images from the movie. that I actually ended up liking it. I actually liked it more than the last Hellboy reboot because I felt like it was more faithful to those Mignola comics and that world of Hellboy.
I like the last Hellboy movie because there's like a giant fight scene like with giants, and like they're
Right.
like the CGI is pretty decent, I think, in that movie. And yeah, I feel like they were trying to like say, hey, we're gonna try and do something that like is familiar to the previous two Hellboy movies. And that's where I think that one kind of made me not like it as much. But this one, like, it's its own thing. We've got a new actor for Hellboy, which also he does a great job of being Hellboy. I didn't think I'd like it. And I like the fact that they like the comic is set like in the 50s, which is a different time frame than what we've ever seen for the movies so far. So I think that also made it feel a bit more like a reset and refresh. And so I think those elements really made me like it a bit more. But overall, there were times where I was just like, Hellboy is talking quite a bit, and he doesn't talk that much in the comics. And it kind of almost made me think maybe this would have worked better as like a TV show or like a series, like through Netflix, like a 6 episode show. You can draw a couple more things out. The like cut frames and transitions were very much like a comic book where you like turn the page and you're like in a different scene, which is totally fine in a book, but it also just kind of like took me out of the movie at times. Where like, because like normally I feel like in movies we have like, oh, the sun goes down, or like, like we close a door and we open another door and we're in somewhere else, but the screen just like fades to black. And some of those transitions kind of took me out of the movie. I was like, these transitions made me feel like maybe it would have worked better as like a show where it's like, okay, it's 24 minutes long and we do like 4 or 5 episodes, and we have like an intro song and all that stuff. But for a movie, it still works pretty well, I think.
Yeah,
Because again, that's
and
because
like I
that bar
said,
was so low.
like the editing was like a little bit like nauseating, and the person who directed it, Brian Taylor, has directed like the Crank movies, which are also like super like fast paced and nonstop. He did Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance, so he doesn't necessarily have like a great track record. But I do think sort of like working on those like bigger movies helped him sort of deliver something that felt bigger than the budget that it had. And Jack Kesey, who plays Hellboy in this, I don't think there's been a bad Hellboy actor, which is cool.
Yeah.
Considering there's been, less like subpar Hellboy movies. I think the last one, again, like when I watched it again, I was like, oh, it's not as bad as I kind of remember. But it's clear that in that last one, they were just trying to do too much to set up like a cinematic universe. And like, they put Lobster Johnson in it. There's a bunch of like there's like five different Hellboy stories in that one movie, which is nuts. But like you said, I think sort of the world of Hellboy and the BPRD is really well suited for like a series. Like I would really like to see an animated series. And I thought it was cool that, like you said, it's set in a different time period where, as the first two, yes, they flash back to sort of World War II and when Hellboy came to Earth and stuff like that, but they never sit in those time periods too long. And I think what was cool about this is because, particularly like in the first one where they were hiding who Hellboy was, it was kind of cool that even these people in the mountains, in cold country, like knew who Hellboy was. And it was like
Yeah.
kind of like a part of it, which I thought like was the most comic booky aspect of the film that I really enjoyed. And like I said, some of the imagery, if you've read any of the Hellboy stuff, which I've been doing a lot lately. I haven't read the Crooked Man story, so I don't know how accurate it is to that. But based on the cover you showed with the shovel, I'm like, oh, that's pretty accurate. Um, and the biggest surprise for me was when I saw Jeffrey from The Fresh Prince as the priest. I was like, what the fuck is he doing here? That was kind of nuts. And yeah, I like the movie, but I do think that it's one of those things where like it's diminishing returns in terms of like cinematic outings. I do think Mignola put this out to kind of like I think in some ways he might resent those Guillermo movies because they're so like so Guillermo. Okay. And so
Yeah.
people focus on that and instead of the world of Hellboy, which I is very like it's kind of crazy because I think like Hellboy is one of those books like Spawn where it's like you can't separate it from the creator. Like it's all like Mike Mignola and his world and stuff like that. So I do think like he like in the last two movies he's tried to sort of like distance himself from that. Not that he hates those movies, but I think he wants people to understand like there's a whole world of Hellboy and sort of Hellboy existed before those two movies and you should be interested in that. So it's clear that even though this was the lowest budget film and sort of like the tiniest in a lot of ways, that this is the one that he was the most involved in, the most proud of. Like you see him doing like interviews and stuff like that. So for me, watching it and like more recently reading, you know, Hellboy comics and BPRD and sort of a lot of that, I felt like, oh, like this is more in touch with like his original vision. Whereas like those first two movies are the best, but they take a lot of liberties with the source material and definitely are more adaptations.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people haven't read the amount of comics of Hellboy's world, and so they just think like those first two movies of Guillermo del Toro, that's what Hellboy is. And when you read The Crooked Man, it's a really stripped down book, and it's very much like how this movie is, where it's like in the middle of nowhere, Appalachia. Like there's no like monsters or things like that. It's like, nah, it's just like a ton of witchcraft and like devil stuff, which they do explore in those movies, but like on a very like they're because it's Guillermo del Toro, it's very monster focused.
And it's
And
fantasy. It's more
yeah,
fantasy than the occult side. Like whereas like the books are more like occult, like devil worship kind of stuff. And it talks about like especially the first movie, obviously there's like the Nazi stuff and all that. But they're fantasy movies. And like Hellboy is not really a fantasy. Yes, it's like sci-fi, like horror fantasy, but it's much darker and dives into the occult, whereas like those movies are especially the second one, you have elves and you know the
yeah,
lighting and stuff like that. So yeah, I definitely felt that.
yeah. This one felt like more grounded, almost like American Horror Story kind of like, which was why I was like, hey, if this was a show, I probably would think I would like be more on my seat for certain aspects of it, even though I've like already read the comic book. Because like in a show, you're like, oh, what are they going to put in like the next 30 minutes? Whereas I'm like, oh, I know what's happening in the comic. What's going to happen like in the next 5 minutes? I kind of already know. So I feel like the material could have been a little bit more digestible as a show, but if we're just comparing the movie to the comic book, it's a pretty accurate representation of what happens. And there's even more that happens like in this book because there's two stories in this book, and that's why I'm like, oh, you could have done like a series, like 6, 7 episodes, pretty easily. I feel like because they don't even finish like the last third of this book in the movie. So, but overall, yeah, I think the movie very accurate to the source material. We've definitely moved away from Guillermo del Toro's like version of it, even though it still holds up today. And this one is pretty comic book accurate.
Yeah, and I would like to see sort of Hellboy again in this world, but I would love to see it in a video game or an animated series. I think in terms of like cinematic outings, we've seen the best, the worst of Hellboy. I don't know if there's much, and also like an appetite from like the people financing these movies, you know, like they haven't made that much money, and even though I think they're sort of getting made based on the success of those first two films, which weren't even like the biggest successes. I mean, we look at those movies fondly, but it's not like they were huge financial successes. And it feels in some ways that this movie maybe have been made to sort of keep the rights or something like that because it's so soon after the last reboot where it's like, hey,
Yeah.
like you probably should have let that breathe. But interesting enough, because it's set in a different time, you could kind of like get away with saying that it's not a reboot. Yes, it's played by someone else, but it's not like it's like a strong sort of I mean, kind of because thinking about it, like now with the Lobster Johnson thing, I think that Hellboy movie might have went with the origin from the Guillermo movies versus like the comic Hellboy, which in this one is sort of like it goes with the true origin of Hellboy, where he had a witch mother and that kind of thing, which I thought was interesting. It gave Hellboy a different aspect. And I thought like what's cool about like that, it grounded him a bit more in my eyes because I felt like in the first two movies, I'm like, well, aren't you like like a godlike character, why are you getting your ass kicked all the time? Whereas in this, it was like, hey, like you were made by mistake. You know what I mean? Like you're a
Yeah.
mistake. Like you weren't meant to sort of be this different thing. Yes, you have this hand that sort of like is a key to unlock things, but you as a character are not much more than that. And I thought that was a really cool take, and obviously much more faithful to the comics.
Yeah. It also, like you said, like it kind of like depowers him a bit, where it's like it makes sense why you get beat up, while you aren't like able to take everybody out,
Yeah.
and being able to ground him a bit more. But it's also like, like if you think of all the influences that you've maybe consumed of Hellboy, like how old he is. Like every time in this movie where like he gets hurt, I'm like, how old is he really in this movie? Because like in the Guillermo del Toro ones, like those take place like in the 2000, and the guy's like they say Hellboy's maybe like his like late 20s, early 30s. I'm like, he's the exact same age he is like right now as
Well,
he is in that movie.
in that one, they say he is actually in his 60s, but he's aged in like reverse dog years. So
Yeah,
he looks
yeah.
27. And in this one, obviously, like I don't know, is it the 60s or the 50s? Because if
It
it's
says like
the
1959, so it's like right on the cusp of it. But I was
which
like,
which is
shouldn't he be a
weird.
teenager?
Yeah,
But
that's another thing where it's like, wait, did he grow like really fast and then just stop? So yeah, I think like the less like you think about Hellboy's age, the better. It's just like cool to see him in the 50s in a place where like there's no technology. Obviously, they just have their radio and they're in sort of the mountains and coal country and have to sort of deal with this supernatural presence. And I thought it had a really good setup. Hey, they're on the way
yeah,
to sort of deliver this other thing, and based on sort of like they pass this evil which sort of sets them on this path and stuff. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was good. I think it's great for Hellboy fans. If you're someone that like you only know Hellboy from those Guillermo del Toro movies, this is probably not the movie for you. But if you're a fan
yeah.
of the comic books and Mike Mignola's art and the world of Hellboy, you should probably check this movie out.
Yeah, definitely recommend it if you're a fan of the comics. If you've only watched those movies, you got to go in with an open mind that there's other aspects, other influences, other stories about Hellboy that you haven't read yet, and you can pick up the Hellboy comic. Like this is only like I think like $12 or so on, or you can read it on Comixology. It's up there too as well,
Yeah,
and that
Comixology, they have the early Hellboy stuff. I've been on Global Comics as of late. They have a lot of the not just like Hellboy, but a lot of um Dark Horse comics on there. I've been reading Black Hammer and a lot of the BRP PD stuff. Sadly, I haven't read Crooked Man, but all that world is really great. And if you're a fan of it, definitely check it out.
yeah. And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom.